My mom's a librarian, so whenever a librarian asks me to do something, I always say, yes, ma'am, right? So I am absolutely honored to be here talking about Margaret Maron's work. I know the focus of today, at least Durham Reads, is on home fries, and also I think the other one is just storm tracks, right? I just want to give like a kind of overview here about where I'm coming from with the work. I said yes because I am a big fan of Margaret Maron's work. I have actually read the entire Sigrid Harold series and was really upset when I had to, put it down, and did a lot of writing afterwards to get rid of the depression. And then I was really excited. I had just started the Deborah Knott mystery series when I got the call from Joanne. So I know that there's a lot of history that the book, circulates in the book. I know that it's published on the 100th anniversary of the riots and the uprising in Wilmington as a result of the burning of a black press there in 1898. And so I wanted to first say that I'm not a historian, I'm a literature person. And so what I wanted to do in thinking through how to really approach the novel and share some of my insights about it with you was to really think about narrative. And in particular, it resonates with me because I'm a Mason-Dixon line girl. I was born in DC, but I spent my summers right here in Durham, North Carolina. And I want to move through those parts of the novel that really spoke to me and the way I grew up. I spent my spring and summer in Durham and my fall and winter in the DC area. And while reading Home Fries, I was caught by this one piece of dialogue because it brought the North Carolina I grew up in back to life. And if you have the book here, I'm on page 119. I always tell my class, turn to page 119. Right? And of course, I'm dyslexic, so half the time it's backwards. Right? But it's actually the right page. So, she looked about 12 or 13, that endearing time when they teeter between childhood and adolescence, more at ease in sneakers than the 1-inch heels she wore this morning. As she handed us program leaflets, the tilt of her head, her deep-set eyes, and something about her shy smile made me ask, "Aren't you kin to Jimmy White?" "Yes, ma'am," she said. "He's my mama's daddy." "You're Alice's daughter." "Wanda's," she murmured, and led us inside and down the aisle to where Maddie was seated. Alice had been a year ahead of me in school, Wanda 2 years behind. Sometimes I feel as if I'm the only graduate of West Colden High who hasn't gone forth, been fruitful, and multiplied. I remember being young and being hailed by folks in town and in our community who knew my grandmother, Theola Priscilla Green Martin, and don't you forget it. Folks would say, "Are you Ma Martin's grandchild?" Or sometimes they would say, "Are you Ma Martin's grandbaby?" I like grandchild better. And I'd say, "Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir." And sometimes I just wouldn't say a thing, which got me into a lot of trouble. But I was always proud to be a member of my family and even happier to belong to someplace. In DC, I didn't get much chance to belong. My mother and I moved around in the city. And the city was basically for school, for time with my father who lived in another part of town. And if I could manage it, friends, homework, movies, all that kind of stuff. But North Kakalaki was always home. But to begin at the beginning, for those of you who haven't quite done the homework and actually read the novel, right? So those of you who are not quite familiar, I keep wanting to say fries because it just sounds, the foodie in me just is hungry. I had only a grapefruit today, so Home Fires is part of a series of mysteries centering on Judge Deborah Knott, who's the 36-year-old daughter of a famed bootlegger, Keziah Knott, who, quote, had run White Lightning from Canada to Mexico, and a citizen of Colton County. At the beginning of her tale, her nephew, AK, running with two boys who aren't quite too cool for school, Raymond and Charles, he gets in trouble for vandalizing a cemetery by spray painting and turning over gravestones. In the weeks that ensue, one church is torched and then another two, and the boys are suspected of all three. The situation turns to capital murder when not one but two dead bodies are discovered in the last church, the historic Mount Olive AME Zion Church. My grandmother was a member while she was living of St. Joseph's AME. And every once in a while, my uncle still sends me the program from the church there. You know, they mentioned your grandmother in the prayers today. Anyway, the drunk sexton Arthur Hunt is one of the bodies that's found, and he lives on the premises. The other one turns out to be the charred remains of Isaac Michener, the long-lost uncle of ADA Sylvia Sill de Graffenried. Uncle Isaac split when Sill was 8 or 9 years old, and their affinity for one another, being only 10 years apart, only makes his departure all the more painful for the young ADA. What unites black and white here is a general disdain for the charismatic black activist, former member of the fictional Noise, I love that, Noise, Wallace Adderley, whose nickname is Snake, pun intended, and who is at one time referred to as Feral. In the end, it turns out that the boys didn't do it after all. I mean, they did the first thing, definitely, but they didn't burn the churches. But the legacy-hungry little old lady, Avery King, who used school homework papers from the Starling boy, that's the Charlie of the Raymond and Charlie pair, to copy his atrocious handwriting in order to burn down the two churches, Burning Heart of God, Holiness Tabernacle, and Balm of Gilead, that marred the surface and memory of her family's sight lines and legacy. So in a sense, the AME church is kind of thrown in as, something to throw the dogs off in terms of suspicion, right? What we certainly get here is a tale of imbricated Southern families, color lines, literally and figuratively, and new friendships. And I just want to quote from an interview with Margaret Maron. She once said about the book, "I didn't feel I could keep writing about the South and not write about race. Secondly, there's been an ongoing dialogue on the national level about race, and also in our state with the 100th anniversary of the burning of a black newspaper's office in downtown Wilmington, North Carolina. And I wanted to be part of it. Lastly, Sill de Graffenried, the young black ADA, has been a puzzle to me from the beginning. I wanted to know her story. I want to move through some of the familiar stories about racial conflict in the South that Maron reproduces in the novel, because I think that some of the point here, at least from my perspective, is that Maron wants us to think about how family stories and our ideas about what that term might mean, the term family, right, might mean, how individuals interpret it. These stories are the ones that in the end paint the picture of the racial climate, at least to some extent, in these parts. So what I'm doing is I'm moving from great historical events to kind of the everyday life of people constantly thrown in contact with each other and how they narrate and handle that interaction. So the first, I'm on page 46. One of the first family stories we encounter is about Deborah's brothers and integration. Deborah, by the way, is the youngest of 12, 13 if you count the first stillborn child. As Deborah remarks, and I read the quote on page 46 here, "Even though Daddy was a New Deal Democrat who admired Mrs. Roosevelt's spunk, I've never been truly totally sure of his rock-bottom feelings on race. But I was willing to bet that Ben and Jack were punished not so much because they'd made a racist slur, but because they'd picked a fight over something that was none of their business. If he has a credo that he's tried to pass on to us, it's live and let live, and don't go sticking your nose in stuff that ain't none of your business. Some of us still keep getting our noses thumped," right? So in this particular moment, we find out that, in fact, Ben and Jack, who've been swimming at the same area for a long time, have been joined by black swimmers. And some of those black swimmers have white girlfriends. And one of them makes a rude remark to one of the young boys, and some kind of altercation ensues. And so this is her way of telling a story about that incident. I think every Southerner in my family, and that I know, could probably say the same about at least one of their relatives. The same being, I don't really know what their deepest feelings are, right, about race. What makes this place different, this place here, and I know it because I lived that imaginary line of my childhood, is that you know how folks feel because they are kin to you or to someone you love, so there is that respect. But you might not actually know what those rock bottom feelings are, to tell the truth. There's the aura of the unspoken here, and Maron keeps to that not knowing beautifully in this novel. And I think that's just one of the signal achievements of the work. Not only in terms of a mystery novel where you want to know everything, right? That's what makes racial mystery novels very different, right? There's this need to kind of know everything because that's the way mysteries are wrought. But there's also this sense that if you know everything, then we might have solved the problem, but we know we're in the midst of it. So we can't, right? So some of those feelings, there has to be kind of a withholding. And I really like the rhythm of that in this particular novel. The second incident that involves family, to some extent, is in a conversation, I'm on page 87 here, is in a conversation with Ed Gardner, the Colton County ATF agent. Am I right about that? The ATF? Right? Agent. Deborah Knott gets all fired up, no pun intended, over Gardner's speculations about who might have set the fire and whether it was responded to promptly. Remnants of 911 is a joke in your town kind of abide here, right? I'm on page 87. I guess this is Ed speaking. I guess what I'm saying is that I've never felt we were so polarized. Oh, I'm sorry, it's not Ed, it's Deborah. I guess what I'm saying is that I've never felt we were so polarized here in Colton County that we'd have hate burn-ins like last night. You're going to find it was a kid acting out, doing it for kicks, then for hatred. You just wait and see. I'm sure you are. I didn't realize I was getting so vehement till Ed held up his hands in surrender. Hey, you don't have to convince me. One thing though, this volunteer fire department, any blacks on it? You saying you don't think they came out as fast as they would have for a white church? I snapped. Don't be so touchy. I'm just trying to see the big picture here. It's like one of those moments, like just saying, right? We came up the steps beside the fenced-in play yard of a church-sponsored daycare center. Under the watchful eye of two white women, little children were swinging, playing in the sandbox, hanging from monkey bars, black kids, white kids, and a couple of kids of Asian descent. Surely it was going to be different for them. As the scene ends, Deborah seems to look wistfully over at the group of kids playing, white, black, and Asian, and muses, surely it was going to be different for them. As if the children will spring from their childhood into adulthood that has no traces of the conversation she has with Ed. It is a false wish, and she knows it, and her sadness is palpable. This moment in Home Fires takes me back to my colonial and revolutionary American literature class at Princeton so many years ago. We were reading from the text of a noted scholar and statesman, and when we got to one passage in particular, it blew my mind. And even today, I teach it whenever I can. The title of the passage is Manners. And excuse me for reading at length here, but I think it's important and goes along with the discussion we're trying to have today about narratives. It would be really bad if I left it at home, wouldn't it? I got it. It is difficult to determine, this is written in 1781, but not published till 1787. It is difficult to determine on the standard by which the manners of a nation may be tried, whether Catholic or particular. It is more difficult for a native to bring to that standard the manners of his own nation, familiarized to him by habit. There must doubtless be an unhappy influence on the manners of our people produced by the existence of slavery among us. The whole commerce between master and slave is a perpetual exercise of the most boisterous passions, the most unrelenting despotism on the one part, and degrading submissions on the other. Our children see this and learn to imitate it, for man is an imitative animal. This quality is the germ of all education in him. From his cradle to his grave, he is learning to do what he sees others do. If a parent could find no motive either in his philanthropy or his self-love for restraining the intemperance of passions towards his slave, it should always be a sufficient one that his child is present. But generally, it is not sufficient. The parent storms, the child looks on, catches the lineaments of wrath, puts on the same airs in the circle of smaller slaves, gives a loose to his worst of passions, and thus nursed, educated, and daily exercised in tyranny, cannot but be stamped by it with odious peculiarities. The man must be a prodigy who can retain his manners and morals undepraved by such circumstances. Who is that? Recognize that voice? Most of my students usually say, anti-slavery activists, right? It's Mr. Jefferson, Mr. Thomas Jefferson. And when you read this, it's short, as my grandmother would say, and pretty sweet. But you know when you're reading this that he's not just talking about people he doesn't know. All right? He's not just talking about a system. He's talking about kin in some way, shape, or form. And of course he goes on in the other chapters to say pretty awful things, right? About not only about blackness, but about the state of Virginia, actually, which North Carolinians don't much mind, right? No, sorry to the Virginians in the room. I apologize. I have family in Virginia. It's all good. It's all good. What I am getting at here is a simultaneity with which one can speak about the races in one breath and then engender so much feeling about one's racial kin in the next. It's that feeling between and among us, black, white, and red, that has been so maligned through terms like liberal white racism or Uncle Tom or Apple even. But racial feeling doesn't come from without. It comes from within. It is there in our families, which are white but really not white. And it's Deborah's family tree here that is of interest to me now. When I think about her family tree, I keep thinking, what other offshoots are there? Right? What other narratives about Deborah's kin are there that have yet to be told, right? And also not even black, but a little piece of one another, right? So every Southerner I know has that story about somebody who went off, right? Disappeared, but they always kind of come back, right? Sometimes there's a baby who's not their baby, or sometimes there's a kinfolk who's a cousin who gets raised up in the same family. Looks a little different from everyone else, but that's the cousin thing. Then you find out, I've been living with my brother for 30 years and never knew it, right? Everybody's got that story. And my grandmother's family had a couple, right? A couple really good ones. And if we have some time during question and answer, I'll tell a few of those. The kind of one where you're looking through the scrapbook, you're like, Nana, who's that? Flip the page, right? Looking through another scrapbook. But Nana, I don't understand, why is this scrapbook from Texas? Flip the page, right? Right? The next family story doesn't occur in one moment, but is given to us as the novel progresses, and it is Syl's narrative. But it is also the narrative that as it's sown, so is the friendship between Syl and Deborah. While Deborah's family name is Tarnis, bootlegger's daughter, so she can't really be the pot calling the kettle here, there is a sense that Deborah's family's racial feeling is somewhat murky for us, that earlier part, right, where she says, I'm not really sure what my daddy's deep feelings were about the race question, right? While Syl's upbringing as a dark-skinned girl in a sea of light-skinned faces makes her racial life more vexed and somewhat interior, right? And this is really interesting. There's a certain kind of interiority to Syl's life. Deborah's trying to get to know her. And there's a way in which Deborah's life around race doesn't really come home, except for in her feelings for Syl. That she knows there's tension between them, right? And she really wants to get to the bottom of that tension. We do not hear about, for instance, with Syl, we do not hear about what she might have had to endure at Duke Law School as a young scholar. But we do know what her family's wounds are. And Deborah's attempts to psychoanalyze them fall short of the mark, we later learn. This time on page 110, 111. This is when we first find out a little bit more about Syl. So Deborah says, but she sure is hard on young people that break the law, especially young men. Maddie nodded thoughtfully. Maddie is the woman who is a housekeeper in her house and has been there since her childhood. Probably, this is Maddie speaking, probably because of her uncle running away like that. He made a lot over her, and they say she took it awful hard when he left. He was only 10 years or so older than her, and just as dark-complected as her. Only's one of Ms. Michener's family that was. All the others is real light. And there's a parentheses here. As someone smack dab in the middle of the color chart, Maddie speaks of skin tones as casually as I talk about the color of someone's hair or eyes. But it does aggravate her if somebody preens herself on being light or puts another sister down for being too dark. Like they was extra smart for deciding to get themselves born like that. She sniffs scornfully. I like that part, right? Best I recall, Sylvie must have been around 8 or 9 the summer Isaac run off. They say she about cried herself sick after that. She didn't come as much or stay as long. Was it that uncomplicated, I wondered, nibbling on more raw beans? They're out on the porch, on the larger porch, shelling beans. A girl child so wounded by her young uncle's abrupt flight that she unconsciously tried to punish every young black male who strayed from the straight and narrow. This is her musing. And then Maddie says, you keep on eating my beans, and they ain't going to be none to freeze. You so hungry, why don't you go and get some of that ham I fixed for supper? Ham? I suddenly realized just how hungry I was. I said, abandoning the beans as abruptly as Isaac Michener had abandoned his niece. So finally, perhaps one of the most interesting moments where family and knowing and prejudice and racism come into play is over the most unlikely of incidents. In order to prevent the black daughter, LaShonda, of a preacher, I think his last name is Freeman, Reverend Freeman, from getting second-degree burns during a pig picking, Deborah submerges LaShonda's hand in ice and rushes her over to Aunt Sister, who it turns out is a fire talker. Everybody ever had fire talkers? Right? Yeah, we had, my family was people who had the sight, right? My grandmother didn't have it, but I guess my grandmother said it was passed on to me when I was a child. Because when my grandfather died, my great-grandfather died, he appeared to me in my sleep. Well, he woke me up, actually, which I was grumpy about. I was a pretty good sleeper back then. And the reason why I remember all of this is because he sat on the end of my bed, and he said, you know, now be a good girl. And I was just like, what are you doing here, right? Hello, it's 3 o'clock in the morning. And I was about 7 or 8, I guess. And I think he talked to me for a little while. And you know, kids, you wake up half the time you're dreaming, you don't think anything of it. I went back to bed, heard my mother crying in the other room when I woke up in our apartment. And so I got out of bed and I went and I was like, what's wrong? And she's like, you know, great-granddaddy is dead. And I said, oh no, he's not, I just saw him last night. Biggest mistake I ever made. Freaked her out, right? Started talking to my grandmother, and then she put me and grandmother on the phone, and then my grandmother had to have a talk with me saying if anything like that ever happened, then it would be something we would talk about. I could talk to her, but I wasn't to really go around the funeral telling people that he was okay. Because after she talked to me the first time, I didn't kind of take her seriously. I'm like, but everybody will want to know. So I went as a nice ambassador, like the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, you know, at a wedding, you know, like great-granddaddy's fine, you know, I saw him last night, and people were like, oh, you know, they started like, why is she crying, right? So that was like kind of my first movement into, you know, the kind of spiritual world of North Carolina folk. So I'm going to read this quote on 163. It's okay, honey, I said. She'll take away all the fire. LaShonda's terrified screams dropped to a whimper. Her brother came running and hovered protectively, if helplessly, while I continued to pat her thin, bare shoulders and murmur encouragement. Feel the hot going out of your hand? She nodded, her for wide eyes intently focused on Aunt Sister. Soon it will be all gone, I promise you. All around us, people watched with held breaths as Aunt Sister's lips kept moving. Reverend Freeman burst through the ring, sealed just behind him. Baby? He knelt beside us and put his arm around his daughter, and she leaned against his chest with a little moan. But she didn't pull her injured hand away. She's making it better, Daddy. At last, Aunt Sister raised her head and pushed back a strand of white hair that had escaped from her bun. Old and faded blue eyes looked deeply into the young brown ones. All the fire's gone, she said. It wasn't a question. LaShonda looked at her hand and flexed her small fingers. Yes, ma'am. Her palm and fingertips were smooth and unmarked. No blisters, only a faint redness. A collective sigh erupted from the crowd, and so many people started talking then that I was probably the only one who heard when LaShonda smiled up at her father and said, "Mommy's wrong, Daddy. These white people are nice." I stood up, feeling suddenly drained and weary. A whole lifetime of knowing, yet I'm still surprised every time I get reminded that racism isn't a whites-only monopoly. And what happened at the pig picking was that the reverend comes, but his wife decides not to, because a lot of people are really angry about the burnings at the churches, the local churches. So we might scoff at a child's simple equation of goodness and whiteness through one deed, as not enough or never enough. But I know from my own North Carolina family, our stories of friendship and even marriage across color lines always start with a kindness or a debt that can only be repaid through a settled protection, passed down through generations. Like your grandmother says to you, you know, you go and take this bread to Miss such and such. You're like, I don't want to go up in there, that house smells, blah, 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 you know, it's on the other side of town, you know. And your grandmother's like, it's about something you can never know. So take this thing, take this bread, go to her house, give it to her, and you sit with her for a while. And that was the one thing we all hated as grandchildren. Why do you have to sit? I mean, I delivered it, right? You know, can I go play now, right? But, you know, I remember visiting all the old folks that my grandmother made me go, and I was the youngest, so I really was the one who did it a lot in the summers, because the oldest kids would, like, get out of the house. You know, just back in the day when the 70s, when you'd leave the house at 7 a.m. and not come back till 7 p.m., nowadays, children don't leave the house at all, right? If we came back, they'd be like, what are you here for? I'm like, well, I was going to get a drink of water. There's a hose out there. There's plenty of water, you know. Miss Gilm's got her back door open. Why don't you go over there? I'm sure she got a couple cups. You'd be like, Nana, I love you. You know, I love you too. Go away. It's summertime, right? Go away, right? And so one of the things I remember, though, is in sitting. It wasn't just in the bringing, but it was in the sitting, right? You get to hear the story, you get to hear the narrative about that kinship and about that obligation. And so you knew that when you grew up, if anybody ever said anything about the Wheelers or the Gillums or all the people that we lived on the block, or the Spaldings or the Boldens or anyone who's on my grandmother's road, right, on that street, you'd say in your 20s, and I remember someone saying, hey now, don't you say a daggone thing about such and such. You don't know nothing about it. And then I was like, oh, my grandmother. It's the same thing she told me, right? So those tales of obligation and friendship are imbricated and fraught, but somehow they remind me of this place I call home. These interpretations and stories of family are part of the fabric that make for the kind of racial feeling one gets while growing up in the South. A New Yorker friend once said to me that New York is a state of mind, implying that you can't know its greatness until you experience it. You know how people always call it, you going to the city, right? And I always say, which one, right? And anytime someone from New York tries to get on me for coming back home, and boy, did they get on me when I said, you know, I'm going to go for a job at Duke. Are you crazy? You've lived in San Francisco, you lived in Chicago, you know, you spent summers in New York, you know. What? Why? And you were just in Madrid for like half a year. You going back down south? You better be careful. Do you know what you're getting yourself into? Right? But every time they say that to me, especially the New Yorkers, I only remind them that they don't have too far to go to see the legacy of slavery in New York City. That in the 17th century, New York had a larger black population than Maryland or Virginia. And for those interested in the fascinating account of slavery in New York, you got to see Leslie M. Harris's book, In the Shadow of Slavery, African Americans in New York City, 1626, 1863. And she follows New York City from the time of its founding as New Amsterdam by the Dutch to its handover to the British, actually by the Duke of York, hence New York, right? Handover from the Dutch to the British. And the course of slavery in that particular place, some of the stuff that happened will curl your hair. And many of you will remember, I think it was in 91 or 92, maybe 91, they were digging in Wall Street for a new building. And as you all know, that's the old slave market. That's why the market's built there. Sometimes things don't change, right? And they found a gravesite, which they thought were 3,000 bones. 3,000. They found out 3,000. They did, DNA tests on it. And Howard came up with all this room with a museum, in conjunction with the Smithsonian, to kind of like get the bones out. And when they finished, they were at 20,000. But they had to stop, apparently, because they wanted to just commemorate it with a plaque. And you can see the plaque there. It's very tiny. You could miss it too. But they found out that they were actually people of African descent who had been enslaved in New York City, and that they were men, women, and children in that mass grave. And some of the injuries were so brutal that literally some of the children had to put cargo on their heads so heavy that their necks had broken. Right? And it was the way in which the wounds were set that they figured out the pattern of breakage for the kids. And most of them were malnourished. So, I can't help but end this lecture thinking about family and civil rights and what is most in the minds of those of us in the state in this post-Amendment 1 era, a time that has pitted family members against one another, a time that has seen the idea of family both expand and contract with the check of a ballot or the swing of a gavel. I want to paint a picture for you here of what it means to be a daughter of the South, of a grandfather who headed Durham's the Committee on Negro Affairs in 1949 and helped craft what became the class action suit, the blue suit. My mother was a plaintiff in that suit, which also provided a precursor and the groundwork for Brown v. Board. I love that moment when Judge Knott says how she feels being safely on the other side of Brown v. Board, right? She has like the pleasure of hindsight, right? She can look back to a time that she did not know. And I'm about the same age as Deborah Knott. So a little bit of musings here. Bynum, North Carolina is a town that you can literally look the other way while going through and miss entirely. Once a general store post office, the structure that we're going to now is a local venue for small events showcasing new Southern arts and music. Food trucks with ice cream, hot dogs, and barbecue were parked just outside the front door, and I swear the square footage of the trucks seemed to outdo that of the general store where we were all headed. Inside, it was hot as hail. I mean juke joint hot. Multiple fans buzzed around, and little kids ran from one end of the store to the other, opting in the end to run out the back door to lengthen the landing strip for their game of tag or whatever kids play at these days. I had come along to a concert by Justin Robinson and the Marionettes. Anybody know that band? You're going to get a treat. To help celebrate a lover's birthday, and found myself at the most unlikeliest spot for a dose of hip-hop, string band, R&B sound, and old-time music all smashed together. A mix of hipsters and 30-somethings and queer folks munched on local barbecue, ate vegan burritos, and at times sat perfectly still in the stifling heat, waiting for Robinson's band to play cuts from their debut CD, Bones for Tender. And I left it in my suitcase, because I had transferred it from my briefcase to my suitcase to lighten my load on the plane, so I really apologize, otherwise I'd be passing it out right now. Of Carolina Chocolate Drops, that sound familiar to folks in here, fame, Justin Robinson was now with his own act, but with the memory of fiddler Joe Thompson's sound and the soft echo of the holler not far behind. Justin Robinson married a man in Boston because he couldn't do so in North Carolina, and is openly gay. As many of us know, the Carolina Chocolate Drops take their name from the Tennessee Chocolate Drops, another AFAM string band that recorded in the 1930s. A woman just in front of me is sweating so profusely, I do think she just might fall out. A man in front of me wears a t-shirt with a Confederate flag on the back and something about a history lesson scribbled under it. I paid little attention to him, except for the fact that he is blocking my narrow view of the stage. A man in the crowd catches my eye, a black man in the crowd catches my eye, and we both crank our chins in the direction of the man with the history t-shirt. And we shake our heads. It takes all kinds, we say, without saying a word. And I go, bless his heart, just bless his heart. When the Marionettes finally get going, I am mesmerized. I love it, all of it. Sure, I remember the Chocolate Drops. Who wouldn't remember lyrics like cornbread and butter beans and you across the table, eating them beans and making love as long as we are able, right? Or the 2010 cover of Blue Cantrell's Hit 'em Up Style. When your man wanna go buck wild, right? Take his car to Neiman Marcus and charge everything up and then throw it in the trash, right? I love that one. Neiman Marcus, Institution of the South, right? But in this post-Amendment 1 state, it's been a while since we've all felt like a party. And some of us have been, well, clinically depressed. And I, for one, have never been one for live concerts. I always get parked next to the asshole with something to prove. Note the guy in the t-shirt and you get my drift. But I'm serious, like every concert, there's a fight right next to me. All right? I'm like, I'm 5'3", I'm not that muscled up, and there's always some crazy person sitting next to me. But tonight, sandwiched in with Southerners and uprooted folks from Cali and the East Coast, and musicians, and somebody's grandma in the corner dancing, with Justin and the marionettes sweating profusely and playing full out, nonetheless, and the kids still running up the aisles, and the women sweating and pulling all manner of stuff from their bras. How do Southern women do that anyway? I am brought, like, would you like some juicy fruit? Right? Like, wait a minute, I gotta put my cell phone away. Right? And there's like a little strappy thing that goes, and there's like some kind of magic place where it doesn't get bumpy on the sweater. Like, how do they do that, right? I am brought back to what makes this place so important to us, and yes, so queer. In that most expansive part of the definition. We can't walk away, even if we wanted to. We are here together in this place, loving the same music and sometimes the same women, hard and long and fast. There's something about the fierce simultaneity of it all that just stops you in your tracks. And it reminds me of that Faulkner quote at the end of one of my favorite novels, Absalom, Absalom, right? Where Quentin, who, is off to his death in many ways in the other novel, right? We find out that actually he dies, right? But he says, he asks him, there's a question being put to him that's from earlier in the novel that's not really a question, and it's really about the South. And he says to himself, I don't hate it, I don't hate it, I don't hate it, I don't hate it, right? Like a mantra. Somewhere in the middle of the set, when the youngest kid drops from exhaustion and is passed from one adult to the other until she lands in a stranger's arms because the last one holding her just needs a break. And so it is me holding the sun-browned girl child and rocking out just a bit when Robinson sings Kissin' and a Cussin'. A Chocolate Drops tune for sure, but as I find out later, with an opening vocal by local hip-hop artist Charlotte Amons, who is dropping her first CD, Twilight, for Gladys Bentley this weekend as I'm giving this talk. And everybody remembers Kissin' and Cussin' from the Chocolate Drops, but I'm gonna play the version on his album for you.
Each pound around.
This is Charlotte.
Change my infidel and abuse. Arouse a food, provide a cigarette, ride and live. Hits quicker like lightning light. It's quiet, light and slow. Horizons a shushy line. Your business is every shut eye. Ain't dog dead asleep. Shit sees no blood stains and love. Real dreams about days. Anywhere I ain't looked at the number. I ain't prayed, so I'll kiss and cuss till I'm carried away.
Tell me, pretty baby, do you think you're too sweet to die? Now tell me, pretty baby, do you think you're too sweet to die? 'Cause we kissed and we cussed and we carried on. We kissed and we cussed and we carried on till the break of dawn.
All right, so just to get you a sense of his range, I'll play one more here. This is one of my favorites. It's also kind of quirky. This one is when the grandma starts standing up to dance. There was some square dancing going on too. Very interesting.
Drums sound while
Yeah, that refrain's weird, but it's like, you'll take this flash, we'll drink this gin, we'll use butcher paper to replace your skin. You know, that's what happens to you after the drinking, right? You're like, there's a whole part of my skin missing, right? So it is a certain kind of queer feeling bound to the racial, nevertheless, that brought me back to Kakalaki. And in this place, we are artists, musicians, writers, chefs, cooks, and activists, making and marking time together somewhere in a holler in the woods. When I listen to our queer hip-hop funk laced with a string band sound now and then, when I feel Robinson add that violin and viola that I put down for a soccer ball and a pair of good leather reins so long ago, I remember sneaking off to buy Shine with my uncle. Yes, I did. When I was not yet 9 years old, I used to hide in his trunk. And he always stopped, you know, to put things right, you know, to get some ice and everything. And I knew he'd open it up, you know, go to the nearest gas station. So I thought, I'm not going to die in here, right? And then I would be with him, but he'd be too far away from home to put me back, right? Spending all day in the hills, running around with people I did not know, but who were used to visitors nonetheless. In that beautiful summer in Kakalaki dream, it is night, and somewhere to my left a fire crackles, and I am laying under a blanket holding on to the sticky hand of some little white girl with a hyphenated name, and listening to the strings echo in the holler along with the sound of the dogs baying, the gentle laughter of women on the porch, and the cutting sounds of men's foolishness out by the shed. And yes, the shadow of trees around me, oaks and pecans, redbuds and ironwoods, pine and cedar, canopy and menace, all at once. Somehow, with this novel and the music I'm talking about, and both of their aesthetics of simultaneity and historic violence and great contradiction and cross-pollination, bring it all back to me. And I am so glad to be home. Thank you. That's good.
You're going to be willing to do some questions?
Absolutely, about almost anything.
And I just want to say, Ms. Maron said she wanted to kind of just sneak in and not be part of the conversation, but you will participate in the question and answers if anybody has anything. Maybe? No? Okay. So she is here, and we will be selling books at the end if anybody wants to have her signing. Okay. Questions?
If there are any.
And will you repeat the question?
Sure. I'll make sure. Yes, ma'am.
What does your shirt say and what's the significance?
Oh, the pig. Barbecue. Right? It's one of like kind of, you know, it's like hippie barbecue. Right? Not quite Kakalaki, but still good. Right? It's wonderful. So I think it's the best barbecue as a foodie. And Sam's my friend. I do a lot of work in the industry. I'm a home chef, and that's where I kind of come into the food studies stuff, which is part of the first lecture I gave for the library. And so I tend to know a lot of folks. And so one day he's about my height, and he was, you know, my friend said, "You haven't been to the Pig yet? It's the guy that sells the hot dogs at the Cardboard Farmers Market." And I was just like, I like those dogs. I like those dogs a lot, but can he do North Carolina barbecue? She's like, mm-hmm. So we went there, fried okra to die for, with a little like Old Bay seasoning thrown in. You know, I spent a lot of time in the Chesapeake, so I could crack crabs and eat them faster than a man at 5 years old, and I still can throw down on a heap of crabs, right? So Old Bay is like my throwback. Whenever I don't know how to cook something, just put some Old Bay in it, right? It'll be good, right? So yeah, it's Sam's joint, and it's a pig, and he's now supplying the bacon for somebody. I can't remember which restaurant, but there's somebody featuring his bacon. And you know, it's North Carolina. We like our pig down here. We like it a certain way, very particular. Right.
Well, tell us some stories from Grandma.
Well, that was one. One of my favorites is she had 3 sisters, and Blanche, Nene, and Willa. Willa was the youngest and the darkest of the 3. And so she was removed for them by 10 years. So really the 3 closest sisters were my Nana, Aunt Nene, who could pass for white, and Aunt Blanche, who was a flapper in New York City at one point. But the way people said that was like it was something wrong, you know. I mean, then when I went and I found out about the Harlem Renaissance, I was like, my aunt was a flapper, and everybody was like, cool, right? Apparently, though they were thick as thieves, And you couldn't say one thing against one sister without the other sister trying to hurt you pretty badly. And so one time somebody said something about, I think it was about Nene. My grandmother's family's from Oxford, and they owned a farmstead out there. And so there was a big road coming up to the house, so you could see people coming. And there's always people that, you know how in the South, if people don't like you, you can't really tell, but you kind of know because, I don't know. They just come up on you, and you're like, the energy in the house changes. Here she comes. She's bringing those children with her again, right? And so somebody came, said something about Nene. My grandmother got really upset about it, and she poured hot coffee on her, apparently. Yeah, I mean, I'm talking like these women were not nice, right? I don't know if it was scalding, if it makes a difference. I love my Nana, so I wanted to think it was maybe lukewarm by that time. But apparently not, because she poured it on this person. She threw it at her. And then she ran upstairs, and she was young. She ran upstairs, and she locked herself in a room, and she opened the window, and she sat on the windowsill, and she said, if anybody comes up here to punish me, I swear I'm going to jump. And so she stayed up there like that for 2 days. And then she, tough, and then came out of that room, nobody said a word. Yeah, my grandmother's stories, like she said, I think she told us most of those stories, which were corroborated by the aunties in other ways, the great aunties. But I think she told us those stories to prevent us from doing things in the summer, because she had, like, at one point, all the parents just dumped all of us on her, because they were like, we're going off to have some fun, you're with your Nana now. So there was like 5 of us in a house and her. And so I think she told us stories like that to scare us, pretty much.
Mm-hmm. Was your grandmother Viola?
Viola.
Yeah, lived on Otis Street.
Yeah. You know her?
I did.
Oh, cool.
Come from that meeting to this one, I was in a club with your grandmother.
Are you serious?
The Maron mothers.
No way. Are you serious?
This morning.
I gotta come. I would love to come. I mean, I'm not like a mom or anything, but
Have you come?
I would love to.
Very well. She lived next door to the farm.
Yes, absolutely. Right there on the corner almost. Yeah, that's my.
Now I got you straight.
Yeah, you know what I'm talking about too, right? She was, watch those quiet ones, right? Theola was whatever, but ooh.
Remember your grandfather?
Yes, he died.
What was your mother?
Carolyn, Patricia Martin.
I want you to say my name, girl. I know Carol.
Are you? Oh my gosh. See, I know. See, you're not too far. My grandma always said, "Better behave, because you never know who you know," right? Yeah. My cousin Joe's a doctor in Atlanta. He's the sweet one. I'm the next sweetest, but Joe's definitely the sweetest. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, Lord have mercy. Yep. It's a small world, huh? Yeah. She married my dad. That didn't wind up so good, but, Yeah, my grandmother was Theola Priscilla, and my grandfather was Davis Buchanan Martin. And he worked at Mutual, but he also was at NC Central as a professor before that. See? Genealogies. Now you all have stories too, I bet. You're going to have to tell me a couple so I can tell my mom, right?
And she used to keep a little girl. She kept some children, because I considered her keeping my little child once.
Oh, really? See?
She kept a little girl. I can't think of her name. If I could, you'd remember her.
Probably.
Roll up. See, it being 94, things don't come.
Hey, you're my role model, okay? You're my role model, okay? Totally, it's all good. See, I got family in the room. Right? Yep.
And I remember the last meeting, she had model mothers. She had a whole spread of stuff on the table.
Oh, she was always like, yeah, she was always, she loved to entertain. She taught me how to set table properly. She's like, you're dyslexic, so like, let's get this right, She felt like the North was uncivilized, and
Me would know her. Her mother was a model mother.
Yes, my mother and your grandmother were very good friends.
Yeah.
oh my gosh.
And the model mothers is still going on. I've been in it 60 years.
60 years. I don't know if I've been in anything that, well, of course not, but I don't know if I've been a part of anything for like 20 years, right? Yeah. Dan and Neb and Giant, who died a while back in Florida. Yeah. That's my whole family tree. Now you guys know everybody, right? But there was a question right here.
Can I ask if you had any conversations with your grandmother?
No, my grandmother died in '94.
I mean, you still have to...
No, but my grandmother and my aunties, I know, it's going to sound kind of strange, but like, they appear to me as like three birds. They're just, and so whenever a friend's in need or whatever, I send you my aunties, because they were thick as thieves, and if they can't help you out, I don't know who can. But I feel like I bought about 8 acres on the back of a watershed in Chapel Hill, and I live in the woods, and it's kind of rocky, lots of iron, and I get tons of birds up there. And every once in a while, I see 3 birds sitting in a tree, and I'm like, whoop, there they are, So yeah, I talk to her a lot when I'm walking my dogs, and I can't figure out something. Yeah, so yeah, I do. You're right, I absolutely do, and I miss her. Because she basically helped. My mother was a good mother, but my grandmother gave me my ethical life. I don't know really how to put it more than that. Like, there was something about my grandmother. She would say things, and I didn't really understand what they meant, but I think that was a point. One time somebody in the neighborhood gave me a bike, and I didn't, and I brought it all home. I was like, I got a shiny bike for nothing, woohoo! And my grandmother didn't look pleased, and I was just like, it's cute. I'm like, it's cute, I'm cute. It's all good, let's go make supper. And my grandmother said, what'd you do to get that bike? And I was just like, cuteness? I don't know, and my grandmother said, just because somebody gives you something doesn't mean you ought to take it. And I was just like, well, what kind of craziness is that? This is a brand new bike practically. The other kid doesn't want it, it's just gonna go to waste. And my grandma said, now I'm going to put this bike on the back porch, and I want you to think about that. And then, tomorrow if you want to come out and ride it, and we'll have a little talk. Well, when she wanted to have a little talk, she was quiet, so she would say a few things and then nothing for like half an hour, like torture you. But then if you tried to leave, that kind of like, where are you going? I'm talking to you. I'm like, you haven't said anything for half an hour, but don't you talk back to me, right? That kind of thing, like you're like in prison. You're like imprisoned in this like soliloquy that could go on for a day, right? And I came downstairs and I was looking kind of sad, and my grandmother said, so what are you going to do? And I said, give it back. And she said, why? I said, I don't really know why. I said, but it doesn't feel too good anymore. I don't feel good about it, so I'm just going to take it back. And then she was like, you do it nicely. And I'm like, So I rode, and I was like, should I get on the bike and ride it? Then I was afraid I'd scratch it before I got it back, So I ended up half riding it, and half getting on it, and half getting off it, taking it back. And the kids were like, in the neighborhood were like, what are you doing? I'm like, I don't know. I'm conflicted. But yeah, my grandmother taught me lessons like that. Yes, ma'am.
I was just going to make a comment. You were born in D.C. and spent your summers here.
Mm-hmm.
I was born in Baltimore, a generation before you, and I got shipped off to the Eastern Shore in the summer.
Mm-hmm.
So, talking about relatives and cousins, and my aunt lived right outside town. My cousins and I would all walk into town. And the last words out of her mouth, now, remember, if somebody waves at you, you wave back, because it's probably a cousin.
I know. And that's the one thing I miss about moving out the South. Like, people didn't say hi to one another. Like, people tended to say hi down here, especially black people. And then when I went up to north to school, when I went to California, that was when it really changed. People thought I was just crazy. They were like, do you know that person? I'm like, no, but hi, And even now that I'm back here, I say hello to everyone. I'm so happy, to be back home and be able to say it, and for people to say, well, have a nice day too. People always, they might be saying, that woman who moved down the road is a little strange, but, But yeah, I missed that. I missed that when I went west. And I had to explain it to people, other people of color. That was a way of like acknowledging one another, especially in a time of segregation when, people cross the street. right? That was a way of saying, we're here in this place together on this sidewalk, and I'm not going to pass you up and not say hi, right? And then you knew also who the left-leaning white folks were in town too, because my mother said she grew up, and they would say hi. Some would say hi on the street, openly in front of other people, but somebody would wait to say hi until you got around the back of the store, you know? Or they say hi in a calling card or something like that. So, yes?
You just explained why my parents always said hi to people I thought were total strangers. They were from California, actually, my parents. But they apparently learned very quickly that if you want to be a good part of society, a good in the moral sense, part of society, you really needed not only to spend time with people, but also acknowledge them in public. And so my father would speak to people and you know, say the person's name, you know, how are you, Mr.
And that was a big thing too, not hailing anybody as like, you know,
And Mr.
aunt
Kennedy,
or uncle. Yeah.
Not his first name. And I didn't really know what that was till I grew up and read about what some of the issues were, or older people will tell me, you know, that's what the issue was. So there's an example of how we don't really know what the deepest feelings of other people are until we open ourselves up, and then even then, you know, it's kind of risky to get too deep, but it's important to begin to see that the differences that you perceive come from something.
And I like, you know, in Maron's book, I love the way that Deborah's curious. She wants to know, you know, Seal's story. And so she really makes the first couple of efforts, like if you need someone to talk to. You know, she's like, why am I going to talk to you? I mean, you know, but she wonders at first by the negative feedback she gets, but she's also really willing to give it a try, because it's really going to be the only thing that's going to work. Just keep saying, I want to talk to you, I want to talk to you, I want to talk to you. Finally, someone will break down and talk to you. It's like my neighbor, you know, first we would wave, you know, and then one day I just pulled my car up on his grass. I'm sure he didn't like that. You know how Southerners about their grass. I didn't know they were so into the grass here. So, you know, Chicago, like we all know it's going to get all brown in winter anyway, so we just roll up on it, right? But not here. You know, so next time you can just pull it all the way into the back there, right by that shed. And I'm like, thank you, sorry. But I pulled it out in the grass and I got out of the car and he was just sitting there and I just went and sat next to him. And I said, well, how are you? And he said, I'm good. We sat for a while. Then he said a few things. And now, if I go down the road and don't say hi or don't stop, he goes, what, busy? Day job? What's up with that, right? And then he'll tell me all my business. And he goes, well, last night when you rolled down this drive, going too fast, by the way, at 10 o'clock at night, you know, I was burning something on the stove, and I remembered that today somebody came by at 3 wanting to deliver something for you, and I was going to take it, but I know you get home late, so, you know. And he's like looking out for me. And he goes, a truck just went down your driveway. Right? And I'm like, sometimes I don't even know what that means. Like, okay. Like, should I go down there now? Or was it a truck with a gun rack? What you trying to say? And the place where I live used to be called Old Colored Road. It's now called Old School Road because it's part of the oldest black farmstead in North Carolina, one of the oldest. And so my road is mostly black folks, but I didn't know that when I went to buy the property, but I just had a feeling on that land. I just felt good. And it was right by my barn too, so it was convenient. And I just wanted to live out on a drive that was away from people, so if anybody came down there, I'd be able to say, go away, right? And I wanted peace. And then I found all this stuff out about the land and my neighbor Cranston and the Farringtons that live there, and you know, everybody's related on that road. And he said something real sweet to me the other day. He goes, so I guess you're about close to family right now too. And then he just turned around, you know, and did something else, you know, that kind of man way, you know, where we couldn't hug it out or anything like that, right? But he was just like, I guess you're about family too, right? But where I'm going to do this project, hopefully with Bill Ferris at UNC and some other folks, called The Road. To see if we can do some what we call like not deep histories, but fairly deep histories of roads that you live on. and then see if we can get maybe high school and grade school kids involved in those projects together. Like, let's research our road. Let's find out how it got here, why it's here, who built it, and why. And then maybe have kids start posting that stuff online as a kind of educational tool for a Southern, because I think it should still be called Old Colored Road. Why? Because that's what it was, and we shouldn't forget. And calling it old school erases what happened there. It's not too pretty, but it definitely would put it out there. And my neighbor agrees with me.
Back to the books.
Yeah, yeah.
When I came to North Carolina, that area that you're reading from, was, they had a sign there called "This is Ku Klux Klan Country." And I wondered what happened to, because her books shows her own curiosity and difference, and there seems to be a great difference.
There's a reference actually to that in the novel. Yeah, there's someone says, I remember there's a sign by there.
And I know we didn't go down that way.
Well, that's why I was telling the story about Cranston. Cranston on my road said, back in the day, Popo didn't come down here, not unless we called him for a pickup. Right? He said, we handled our own stuff down here. He tells stories about his black grandfather, taking a shotgun down the road and having a conversation with one of the white neighbors about what would and would not happen with his grandson on that road. I mean, there's all kinds of stories that he tells, but that's a very unique spot. They owned land. They could defend it. And part of that whole idea of personhood rights, bearer of rights, means you have to have property, right? Once you have property, you have something that you can actually not only defend, but you have redress. Without property, you don't have redress in a court of law. And not in the same way, right? But yeah, they talk about that sign here. Cranston was just telling me about, how Carrboro, which is hippiedom right now, right outside Weaver Road, there used to be a whole stand of houses you couldn't walk down. The black folks would go down to the movies, and they'd go as a group. And you wouldn't be, dawdling afterwards. You'd all go back the same way, because he said there's a family there, and I forget their last name, but he said they were mean as snakes. And they'd try to run somebody off or separate folks, and, they ended up carting off a few folks every once in a while, beat them up pretty bad, and then they would dump them at the head of the drive. Because they knew pretty much if you dumped them on an Old Colored Road, they'd find their way to their families. Because somebody up there was kin to somebody who might know them. So, yeah. I remember as a child going to Philadelphia and seeing the sign, vote for Rizzo and keep the niggers in their place. Philadelphia, right? And I saw signs like that all over. Southern Illinois, there's still a sign. When I was there as a professor 6 years ago, welcome to Klan Country. Holland, Michigan, welcome to Klan Country. Holland, Michigan. Yeah, I took a little drive. We went driving. I got to that sign. We turned around, and we went right back to the city. So it's like, oh, hell no. I'm like, I don't know what's up there, but whatever restaurant's up there and I really want to eat at it, I'm not going to be up here after dark. We won't have to do a lunch reservation. I said, because I'm used to Klan folk down in my grandmother's area, right? But I'm not used to how Klan folk behave up here. And I don't want to, and that was Michigan.
Yeah.
There was a hand up back there.
I just wanted to thank you very much. This has been such an enlightening, interesting presentation.
Oh, thank you.
And unfortunately, you have to leave.
That's okay. I won't take it personally.
Because I grew up in New Jersey, and this is not new.
Yeah, I know.
And when we were recruited to come to Durham from California, I kept saying to my husband, I don't want to go there. I don't like how those people think. But we love every day that we've been here, and we came with the intention of seeing that our schools would be integrated. They became integrated.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of, I'm down here because I'm needed here. And, I can have a lot of fun in New York, don't get me wrong. Every time I go, it's like I'm going tomorrow. Woohoo, that's a whirlwind, right? But, especially after Amendment 1, this place birthed me. I'm staying. We all belong here.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank y'all. Any more questions?
Can I tell one story?
Yes, please do. Absolutely, absolutely.
I'm going to make this as short as I can, but I'm the class of 1960 at Women's College.
which means that I went over there in 1956, and this was the first year that it was integrated. We had Joanne Crane and Betty Lou, I forget her last name. Anyhow, we were so, those of us who had grown up in segregation were so proud of being the first class finally integrated. And I remember one day, I was standing outside the dining hall with some other friends, and Joanne and Betty came walking by, head up, because they had been put over in a dorm that at the end of the hall, they had their rooms so that they could have a separate bathroom so that white girls wouldn't have to share a bathroom. Okay, that was only that first year. After that, they were totally great. But anyhow, I'm standing there thinking, you know, the benighted South is finally coming to terms with race. Up until then, I had always thought that the North was liberal, that the North was totally integrated. It was only the benighted South that had racial feelings. And I'm standing there, and across the walkway, as these two girls are walking by, I cannot imitate the nasal New Jersey accent, but it was, well, this is what we take South to get away from. And it was like the scales just dropped from my eyes, that I realized that it wasn't just the South, that it was North too. Okay, sorry.
No, not at all. Those are important stories. Yes, ma'am.
I just came back from Philadelphia, and I had never been there before.
Oh.
And I'd never thought about the slogan, City of Brotherly Love, that much.
Yeah.
So I went there.
I know. It's yeah, there's a really interesting history. I mean, if you look, one of the things I like to do is, you know, tell students, if you're really interested, you know, go to the WPA narratives, of course. But, you know, a lot of those narratives, as you all know, didn't focus, of course, on the North. And so now historians, there's a whole group of historians, your sister being one of them, who's really working on different histories of the South, you know, looking at how, you know, black girls were treated in particular counties, and looking at the relationship between black girls, white girls, and Native girls, right? Trying to expand this sense of like the social from, you know, when we got African American studies, gender and women's studies, and lesbian and gay studies, finally, we tend to think of them as discrete, you know, right? But I'm black, gay, and a female. So there's no discretion here, right? I'm on one, right? So one of the things people are trying to do, you know, as historians is really begin to think about the imbricated histories, you know, the way in which our histories are kind of together. You know, we still have our, you know, separate departments or what have you, but there are lots of students doing that kind of work down here. There's lots of students doing work in the North and looking at archives and finding bills of sale. Like, all you gotta do is just look in, you know, if you look in the archives, you'll find them. And this one girl said she opened this box, took the top off, and they put her in a room, they put you in the mustiest room they could possibly put you in, because they don't really want you there very long with the archive, because they're afraid you're gonna ruin it, right? And so she opened it up, in this one library, not in all, just one library that she went to, that they weren't very much on scholars. And I think it's because a lot of them didn't want the local history to get out. She opened it up, and it was nothing but a treasure trove of like bills of sale, bills of sale, bills of sale, shipments coming in, trackers coming in. I mean, she said it made her cry, right? She said there was so much traffic going in and out of that town, it was a trading post. And it was a trading post for folks who would capture people, whether they were free or not, bring them down to this certain post, what I call the reverse Underground Railroad, right? Bring them down to a certain post, trade them off to other traders, right? And they would go to market south, right? Because there's a lot of profit to be made once the trade, because remember the formal trade ended well before emancipation. So you still had slavery, but you didn't have a trade. Well, legally didn't have a trade. Get you, and then back.
The young lady mentioned women's college, and I was just wondering for clarity, what's the current title of women's college?
Women's college?
It's UNC.
It's UNC. I thought it was UNC. There's also a women's college at Duke too, the East College. East Campus was a women's college. Yeah. They were almost all in the South called women's college until they integrated. Yeah, or the normal, right.
Yeah, because at first I thought you were talking about Barry. I was my parents saying this. That's what he's called, American Women's College.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah. In the state system down here, the women's there was always a women's college.
Any other, one more question?
This would open a whole other line of discussion.
It's always the last question, right? That does that, right?
I was just going to mention for everybody's benefit, the film Traces of the Trade.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Which I'm sure you're familiar with, which is about a family who made all their money from the slave trade in Bristol, Rhode Island.
They had the ships that the shipbuilding industry in New England profited greatly, and that industry is still. I go up to Cape Cod, I sail. When I look around at Buzzards Bay, I just think there's people there for generations have been boat builders and shipbuilders, and maybe most of them don't even know why. And actually, I'm thinking of getting in touch with a local librarian next summer because I just can't stand the fact that I don't know, to see if maybe I can get in touch and maybe do some research up there and then do a local talk about the connections. But just last plug, great book. Please read it. Recommend it to family and friends. Give it to people for Christmas, Hanukkah, right? Kwanzaa. What's that? Christmas, Hanukkah, Kwanzaa Mas? What is it? No, Hanukkah, Kwanzaa Mas? Yeah. Anyway, thank you very much for coming out.